Greetings, friends. Welcome to another one of our free Friday community classes right here on the Green Art channel. This week, I am excited to be chatting with you about the Læce, the ways of the healer. And this is really a segue into some deeper conversations we're going to be having over the coming weeks and months about traditional herbcraft, traditional wordcraft in the animist, pagan, and heathen traditions of many parts of Western and Northern Europe. So today we're going to start with the person of the Læce, the healer. Who is the healer? How did they learn what they learned? What did they do for their communities? And we have had this conversation in many different ways over the years. There are a bunch of different videos here on the channel that you can find. But today we're going to focus more on practicality. What does this look like in the modern world? Because it can be easy for us to start researching our various ancestral plant lores. And this applies really to anybody, regardless of what tradition you're studying, what culture you're studying, what part of the world you're looking at. When we look at our ancestral plant medicine traditions, sometimes it can be hard for us to see how they fit into the world we live in now. And it can be easy for us to sort of romanticize them a little too much. But when we meditate on what this wisdom and what these practices looked like for real people living in a real world, dealing with real things, it becomes easier for us to say, wow, our ancestors were dealing with similar types of things that we deal with, maybe in a different expression, but they still had their woes, their ills, and their, issues. And I think that that's important in this work because there's a place for the ancestral lore to find fertile soil in the world that we live in. So in this week's class, Læce, ways of the healer, we will be looking at etymology of the word Læce. We will be looking at modern interpretations, specifically my modern interpretations of this word, looking at different types of Læce, different expressions of this practice, and then the training and vocations of witchcraft, how people learned. How did they learn? How did they study at a time when schools, in the way that we think of them now, did not exist for this particular path? And I also want to look at the ways of modern Wortcunning. And we will wrap up today's conversation about Læce looking at Witchcraft now. So, and how you and I can learn this, right? What's our next step into foraying into this work? So stick around for that. Etymology. Now, Læce often gets pronounced as leech as well, and neither one of them are necessarily more correct than the other when we're moving them into modern English. And I have a cheeky little graphic here of the blood-sucking worm called leech, but the etymology stops there, at least according to Paulington and a few other scholars, right? That even though the blood-sucking worm leech was used in ancestral medicine and is actually still used today, by the way, in skin grafts and in issues of necrosis, we put this little worm to work helping clean up those tissues with their magical powers that they have in doing so. There is no real connection. I've heard people over the years say, oh, they called, the old folk doctors leeches because they used leeches in their practice, or they called them leeches because they were trying to grift money off of their patients. There's not enough evidence to support either of those things. And actually, what we do see is Læce being roughly translated now as a physician, a healer, or a doctor. And these are still not quite right. And we're going to get into this in a few slides because we have to understand that the way that folks 1,000 years ago would have defined what a physician is, or what a doctor does, or who a healer is in the context of community is radically different than it is now. So even though we use these words, physician, healer, doctor, as a shortcut, there's so much more to this that is really worth our understanding and meditation. I tend to subscribe to the idea that Læce, the Old English word Læce, comes from the Proto-Celtic legio. And we see this get clarified in etymology through the Old Irish leag, and both of them mean doctor or healer, right? So it's a term of vocation, it's a term of practice, and there is no clear evidence that the name lecha or leech has something etymologically to do with the worm. And part of that is just that the worm is named leech later than healers were called lecha, right? So that's kind of a big flag for me personally. Interestingly enough, by the way, in researching etymology around this term, it's still quite common, if you just do an internet search, to find even reputable linguistic and etymological sources saying that Lecha, the healer, and leech, the blood-sucking worm, are related. So this is a really common thing. And honestly, in my opinion, even if it is factual that they're related, I think that's cool. You know, that somebody who is in a healing vocation is named after a blood-sucking worm, because if you think about it, it's kind of advanced technology, right? It's that this concept of we're going to attach this blood-sucking worm to you, who creates this anticoagulant material in their saliva, and they're going to move blood and release stagnation and drain toxins from the body. That's still very cool to me. So if it turns out someday that we find some evidence that lecha comes from the same root as the leech, the blood-sucking worm, I will adopt the blood-sucking worm as my personal emblem and totem. Modern interpretations. So again, when we think about physician, healer, doctor, what does that mean now in contrast to what it meant, let's say, 1,000 years ago? And I use 1,000 years ago, not arbitrarily. I use that term because this is when the largest concentration of Anglo-Saxon and Old English medical texts, where we get our herbs, monographs, materia medica, charms, rituals, spells, and prayers, were documented, right? It was around the 10th and 11th century when we start seeing older traditions, older practices starting to be written down. So when I say 1,000 years ago, I kind of mean it literally, which is cool. So first, these words, physician and doctor, from the perspective of 1,000 years ago, are not applicable to allopathic medicine. They don't mean the same thing that we think of now when we think of a physician or doctor. Now, physicians and doctors go through institutionalized education, and when we see that education separate from folkloric healing in the past, we find at the time, and I'm not speaking specifically to people now, because I do think that being a physician, being a doctor is a noble calling, and that there's a way to do it that is really virtuous and really beautiful. But back in ye olden times, when colleges and schools of doctors and physicians started to emerge, they were very much elitist. Only certain people had access to them. The people who did have access to them very quickly started to look down on folk healers and look down on the remedies, the plants, the traditions, the rituals around healing. So we would not want to lump those two things together in our modern mind, just because there's a little bit of tension there, right? We want to acknowledge the fact that lecha of the past were really existing in a world where their particular wisdom and their particular arts were shunned, were looked down upon as the medical industrial complex started to evolve into the thing that it is now. So don't let that term doctor or physician cloud your judgment about what this means. And if those words are hard for you, just think about healer, think about folk healer or cunning person. Those are terms for me that work way better anyway. Lecha as a word referring to a specific group of people in a specific place during a specific time is rooted in a specific perspective of healing, right? Lecha saw illness as a particular thing that's different than we see it now. They understood the cause of illness, unhele, being more holistic, more whole person, more animist in nature. They understood that while things could disharmonize within the person, we could also be invaded by external things that include pathogens, but also include spiritual and energetic issues, and that we could also go through loss, where things that should be within us and functioning are lost due to shock or trauma or offense to various spirits. And so when we hear this term Leche, we have to understand that the perspective of what healing is and why healing needs to happen is much more broad and much more nuanced, and it's fiercely animistic, right? It's based on the person being healed being a member of a community that goes beyond the human, right? That we live in a world filled with persons, and these infinite number of relationships that we experience all have some influence over our state of Hela, our state of health, or our state of unhealth. So this is very important. Leche is, of course, connected to language around whole person wellness. When we think about this term, we have to think about the fact that these ancient healers approached people as whole persons. They were less focused on the suppression of symptoms or looking at things in this really piecemeal way, as they were understanding that everything that happens in somebody affects their entire being and affects them spiritually as well. And, we have to acknowledge that in many of the old English herbal and medical texts, again, from documented 1,000 years ago, things are presented sometimes in a very this herb for this issue way, right? Some of the remedies are like, should a person have fog over their eyes? What would we call that now? Maybe cataracts or low vision. Mix a child's urine with local wild honey and put that under the eyelids. That's pretty allopathic. It's pretty, you have a vision problem. We're going to fix it with this remedy, with this charm, and that's that. But its perspective is different than in the way that we open an herb book now and say, this herb is good for the lungs, this herb is good for the eyes, because the person doing that work had a cultural and spiritual perspective and experience of the world that's different than it is now. So I've had people point out, like, hey, some of these charms in the herbarium of Pseudopolis or in Laknunga are pretty reductionist sounding. It's like, well, they are, but the perspective of the person holding it, we know for a fact, was animist. So this is very important to consider. And also, we should wrap up this slide by saying that Leche is both a noun and a verb. A noun in the fact that somebody is Leche, somebody is leech, right? They're acting as healer, but we can also do Leche or Witchcraft, right? That we can do healing, we can do medicine. And so it's an invitation for us to not only think about it as identity, which is what we do in the modern West so much now. It's like everything is like about identity, right? But also, more importantly, what we do, how we show up in the world, what our actions are. And this stream of wisdom comes through all of our ancestral pagan traditions, that what you think and what you believe is not nearly as important as what you do. You can have all of the good, positive, happy thoughts in the world, but if you show up doing terrible things, that's what counts. Similarly, we can walk through the world struggling with fears and anxiety and all that stuff, but if we try to show up and do the right thing and do good things, our actions mean so much more than what we think. So Leche is a verb. It is something done. And I'm sure you're sick of hearing me talk about that all the time, but it's because it's important. So let's talk about some of the expressions of the Leche, the healer. And the first is visionary roots. Now, if you study some of the Anglo-Saxon and Old English scholars, they will, of course, use this term shaman. But I try to avoid that term just because I think that the way that the word shaman is used now is really does a disservice to its actual definition and to various cultures and traditions of either shamanism directly or shamanic practices that we should be working to honor and protect, right? So let's say visionary instead. And we know that the Leche has visionary roots because we see it in the language of these herbal texts documented over 1,000 years ago, that diseases are approached as spirits, that the individual person being healed is approached as a whole person, that states of unhealth can be just as influenced by surrounding spirits, Ulfa, Dwyer, ancestors, deities, the land itself, as it can by body functions not performing properly, performing under or performing over, like hypo or hyper, right? So we know that through these charms and through these rituals and recipes that we have written documentation of, that people were continuing on this tradition of seeing health and whole person wellness in a truly cosmic, animistic, multifaceted way. And our best anthropological connection to really understanding what that means is as that term shaman or shamanism. But we don't need to co-opt that term. We have many terms in many cultures that help remind us that people experienced living in a world filled with persons, navigated those relationships with ritual, taboo, and honor, sacred reciprocity, and understood that every individual in the web of life had the ability to influence other individuals, right? And we get into that when we talk about the parts of soul, especially when we talk about the Mayan aspect of self in other classes here on the YouTube and other advanced classes. So very important to remember these are the roots. And from there, I think, this is my conjecture, but I think we move from the visionary roots where there may have been a priestly class or people who occupied the position of healer or visionary. We also have the aspect of this work that is folk, that is household. And please never overlook the power of household healing, of folk herbalism. It's very, very important. Everybody, to some degree, needs to be their own physician, right? No one knows your body, your mind, and your experiences better than you. You are the actual expert of your own healing. And this is why in my clinical practice and when I teach apprentices, I always say everything that someone says and how they say it and how their body holds while they say it. And by the way, we do have extant uh, practices from the Old English herbals talking about exactly this. This is not something that I made up. Everything they do and say is meaningful, right? Don't ignore anything. Don't argue anything. Don't say, well, I know you're saying it feels like your leg is broken, but your leg looks fine to me, so you must be making it up. It must be in your head. This is what the Western medical complex does to people. They gaslight people and they don't listen to people. They, as a generalized collective, again, there are good doctors, right? I go to a good doctor, so it's not me trying to bag on everybody, but the system itself is built to treat folks that way, and the good people stand out because they choose not to ascribe to that process. So folk and household people are, part of the Leche tradition because they've learned the herbs. They know the herbs that grow around them and how those herbs can be employed in healing. They understand basic patterns of disease state. They understand the taboos and the rituals that need to be done in order to appease spirits and be in right relationship with the spirits of place and the spirits of cosmos and the ancestors. They understand, animal care, how to take care of horses and sheep and what to do when an animal, gets sick or something. They know how to take care of children, oftentimes children being born at home. This is household wisdom, right? This is folkloric household healing knowledge that not too long ago every household had, right? People just knew how to take care of themselves. Now we run to the doctor for every tiny little thing because we've lost the ability and the confidence in knowing, oh, this particular herb that we grow in the garden is there to help us through cold and flu season, or to help mend skin or knit skin or a broken bone. This is very, very important. And Imagine what the world would look like and what our relationship with medicine and how we feed into the medical industrial complex would look if everybody acted as their own primary care provider, right? If the first person that you went to when something felt off was somebody in your own home or yourself, or that you had wisdom and knowledge to turn to as a first response. And maybe, you try that and you're like, okay, I'm not getting anywhere. I better go to a specialist. I better go to an herbalist or a healer or a bone setter, or, maybe a really good physician, naturopath, osteopath, something. But imagine what it would look like if everybody had that knowledge to help and care for the folks who lived in their space and their immediate members of community too. I think this is really the most important, actually, part of herbalism, and the most important position within modern herbalism is household herbalism. Very important. So from them, we start getting specialists, right? We start getting people who, having learned the plants, the folklore, the minerals, the types of waters, the different, types of illnesses people can get, uh, start to become known. People say, oh, this person's really good at setting bones, or this person's really good when somebody has a fever, or this guy over here is really good when somebody gets elf shot, right? He really knows how to fix elf shot in people. And this is where we start seeing specialists. And oftentimes these people still had their, quote unquote day jobs, right? They still did whatever they needed to do to earn a living and to participate in their community, but they had a really good defined skill. Whether that comes from ancestry or an intuitive thing or practice and whatever, who knows? And maybe it's a combination of all three, or maybe it's different for every person. But the cunning folk uh, tradition starts because individual people have a knack for doing this, and the community responds to that knack and it supports it and says, like, yes, this person's presence, this person's knowledge creates change, and so we're going to support them in being cunning, right? It just happens intuitively. The person doesn't wake up one day and say, I'm cunning folk. They just become known for what they do because what they do is effective. In more formal and somewhat occult expressions, we then have sorcery. And sorcerers have always existed. In fact, there is really interesting research from academics, from anthropologists and other academics that link Northern and Western traditions of sorcery to other traditions of shamanism, right? It being visionary, it being based on relationships across the hedge, meaning humans having relationships with other spirits, and those relationships being the source of power. And a lot of people's definition of shamanism is exactly that, right? Humans working with spirits to get things done. Sorcery does that. So here we start seeing schools and traditions. We start seeing people do experimentation, working with the spirits of plants, linking plants to planets and astrological phenomenon, linking plants to the way they appear and how those connect to the way that particular body functions and organs are in the body, and making those links to doctrine of signatures and the like. I put sorcery in here because even though sorcery becomes quite a divergent path from folk healing and wordcraft, they still work with herbs, they still work with plants, and they still would have had a starting point. And that starting point very likely would have been the um, indigenous plant lore of the places where they are. And also, especially in the case of Northern and Western Europe, all of the stuff from the Mediterranean and North African and even a little Asian and continental Europe stuff that came in and was assimilated as part of animist syncretism. So we have to give them a little tip of the sorcerer's hat because they're part of this tradition in their own way, and they take it in a different direction. I mean, it ends up in alchemy, right? Which is super cool. And last but not least, we have witchcraft. And I put witchcraft at the end because following the wisdom of um, Emma Wilby and Owen Davies, my particular perspective of witchcraft is different than the modern and contemporary perspectives. And when we look at witchcraft through the lens of cunning folk and through the lens of Wortcunning, we understand that what people are doing now as witchcraft is quite different than what they were doing in ye olden times. And our response to folks doing witchcraft now is also very different. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of remedies, charms, and rituals around protecting people and crops and land and herds from folks doing witchcraft generally, unless it was defined like it was in many of the Welsh traditions as being specifically white or good, beneficent witchcraft, generally seen as malefic and nefarious. We won't get into that here. There are other classes about that. But witchcraft, again, is another divergent tradition that leans into the ancestral plant folklore of the places where it arrives. And they work with these plants very heavily. In fact, in the modern world, most of the books on plant lore, plant magic, spiritual herbalism that you will find are actually rooted in witchcraft traditions. So that just goes to show how these folks have been wisdom carriers and wisdom protectors all the way into the 21st century, keeping a lot of this stuff alive, protecting a lot of it, and making a lot of it relevant and accessible for those of us who want to practice it. And so many of the documents against witchcraft, 1,000 years ago, accidentally preserved a lot of herbal lore, right? By saying, if you see somebody doing this with this plant, we're in trouble. And also people who were interested in the revivification of craft traditions. Also, we have to thank for keeping some of this stuff alive. So they're part of it as well. So how do folks learn Læce? How do they learn Læchecraft, Wortcunning, Wortcraft? What is the training and vocation? First and foremost, we actually don't know. The reason we don't know is nobody wrote about it. Nobody said, I'm a Wortcunner and here's how I learned, right? It's just not there that we found yet anyway. Who knows what we may find in the future. Part of that is that these traditions were happening at a time when people didn't write stuff down, right? In the 10th and 11th century, when many of the Old English herbal texts, charms, rituals, and prayers were documented, it was the first time they were written down based on ancient traditions. And I think that the training and vocation of the Læce is very much wrapped into that. People didn't write things down, so they didn't write this down. The other thing is that as a mystery tradition, as an occult practice, it's very possible that even if the ability to write some of this stuff down would have been available, folks would not have written it down. It was intended to be transmitted through the apprenticeship model. And we see this in other vocations in the same part of the world at the same time. For example, husbandmen, like for animals, people who took care of horses, midwives. They all had their own traditions, their own secrets, their own mysteries, the way that they did things. And we know more about that they learned through the apprenticeship model. A son was taught by his father, a daughter was taught by her grandmother and her mother. Somebody who was selected or was interested in a village was, trained by the person already doing the work. There wasn't a school, there wasn't a syllabus. It was one person teaching another person. So this apprenticeship model was valued. And while we don't really lean too much on it now because we've moved in favor of these institutionalized syllabus-based models, it's still the most powerful way to learn because the information is being tailored to you as an individual. It's being dropped from one person doing the practice to the other person learning the practice. And we get to see it in action. We get to see what it looks like when it's being embodied, when it's being expressed fully. So the apprenticeship model, I would say we are 95% confident that the Læce of old, the Wortcunning folk of old, learned by learning directly from somebody already doing the work. There weren't books for them to read. There weren't online courses for them to read. If they went out and wandered in the meadows and tried to learn all of the plants themselves, certainly they could have done that. we've done that before, but why would you reinvent the wheel like that when the wisdom already existed and was being held by particular people in a community, right? So it was there. Some of these people we think may have been chosen by spirits. They were set apart. We don't really know what the signs and symptoms of that were in these particular Old English and Anglo-Saxon, Germanic-based pagan cultures, but I have a hunch that that's a big part of it. And there were, of course, people that just had a natural interest. They were just naturally fascinated by healing, by plants, by botany, by working with plants, by crafting herbal medicine and all of that. So, did a mentor see somebody and say, I'm going to pick that person and train them? I don't think so. I think the person would have exhibited natural inclination towards this work and then would have petitioned somebody already doing the work to teach them. And we do see some of that in the later early modern cunning folk traditions for sure. So I think that's just, later example of what had been being done for many centuries before. In order to learn these arts then and now, it requires a lot of time, more time than most people are willing to dedicate to it. It requires a lot of dedication of your time, your energy, and your resources. And it requires gravitas, right? You have to hold space for the work. You have to have it in your bones because, as I mentioned earlier, we don't make ourselves herbalists. We don't make ourselves Læce. We don't wake up one day and say, I'm an herbalist. Not in my tradition anyway. Rather, we put in the time and the dedication, the work, the kinship, the reciprocity, the study, the experimentation until the gravity of the work is so strong around us that other people in our community respond to us in that way and they define us as herbalists. They show up for us as Læce. And this is the old way of doing things, right? People don't wake up and say, I'm a doctor today. Rather, their specialty and expertise gives them that accolade. And this is really hard for us in the modern world with all of our instant gratification and our obsession with certification. We'll talk about certification actually in a minute. But ultimately, the person who quietly garners the respect and trust of their community is a much better practitioner than the person who gets it through boast. And that's just the way of these old traditions. Læce as a vocation, could have had a day job, could have been baking bread all day long, and then in the evenings, connecting people to plants, making medicine for people. We don't really know. I definitely think there were folks who this was their full-time, all-encompassing vocation and spiritual path. In order for us to get some of the wisdom that we have, I think that's just the way that it must have been for maybe some or maybe a majority of these people. But Læce is considered to be a sacred vocation. It requires a lot of respect, in order for it to work out, in order for us to not offend the spirits and not tread too heavily in places where we should not be treading. In the modern world, modern Wortcunning, I like to say, we should always remember that our practice of modern Wortcunning, of modern herbalism, spiritual herbalism, Wortcraft, is rooted in the ancient. Everything we do now has a thread connecting it to the timeless past. Every time we read one of these old charms, every time we open up a new book that tells us something about a plant and we realize that that information is old information, we've been reciting that to each other for thousands of years, we are connected immediately to the ancient herbwise ancestors and to the herb lore and herbal wisdom of the ancient past. And that's so powerful to think that what we're doing in this moment is not happening in a vacuum, but it's happening as part of a timeless collective. And that at any moment, we can open our hands and our hearts to ask for that full cauldron of ancestral wisdom to pour into us. And it does, right? This is very important. People have asked me before, why do you talk about so much ancestral work and this pagan perspectives and heathen perspectives of ancestral work? Because everything we know that allows us to do what we're doing now with plants is because of them. right? And they held the work in a way that we would be stupid to ignore. Again, why would you want to go wander through a meadow and learn every plant from scratch when your ancestors already hold deep relationships with those plants and have already received a profound amount of wisdom that they've passed on to us? And somehow it's been passed on. Somehow it has made it into the world right now. This is so powerful. Lean on extant lore and wisdom. It exists. The stories are there. The folklore is there. We have English herbals that are over 1,000 years old based on material that is even older than that. We have intuitive inklings about plants, and we have wisdom that is in our blood and our bones from our herbwise ancestors. So we should lean on this before we lean on anything else. Very important. We then have to take all the things that we get from our herbwise ancestors, rooted in the ancient, the extant lore and wisdom, and interpret it for the modern world. When our ancestors talked about somebody having water elf illness, that meant something specific at their time, and it means something specific in our time. And the difference may not be that big, but we have to translate it into the language and the perspective of the world we live in if we want to meet ourselves. And for folks that are in clinical practice, our clients, we have to meet them where they are, right? They use different language, different poetic understanding, and different animistic experience than we collectively do now. So we have to think about what it means to live in a world filled with persons in 2025 and what it may have meant to live in a world filled with persons in 925, right? It's different. The wisdom is still the same. We have to catch it and see what it looks like here. It's a very important part of the work. We also need to be inspired by the past to further the arts. This is not something locked in time, right? The charm work, the Galder, the remedies don't end with the Laknunga. For us, they begin with the Laknunga. We rely and lean on the ancestral lore that we have in order to continue furthering the work of Wortcunning in the same way that our herbwise ancestors did. What they had 1,000 years before the writing of these books, before Bald and Killed wrote the Leech book, had changed. It had adapted. They had constantly tried to find new plants, tried to understand patterns, tried to navigate relationships in more and more effective ways. So for folks who practice Reconstructionism in their herbalism or their spirituality and see these things as a dead end or a full stop, you're doing yourself a huge disservice. There's room for it to grow and get bigger and go deeper and refine and become more powerful and more accurate. We have to add our elixir into the cauldron and mingle it with the elixir added in by everyone who's come, before us. This is very, very important. So be inspired to further to add your contribution to this sacred work. We have a different worldview now than we did then. And a lot of us are trying to reclaim and re-embody the ancient animist, multi-soul, polytheist worldview. But we don't live, most of us, in a culture or a world where that comes effortlessly. So we have to think, how do we navigate that? How do we hold ancient lore that comes from that worldview and embody it in modern times that's happening in a different worldview? And it can be done. And oftentimes it's easy and intuitive. And sometimes it requires a little bit of work, a little bit of molding, but we can always do it. Also, ethics are different. We have a different concept of what is okay to do, what is okay to say to people, how it's okay to treat people. A lot of it is better now. A lot of the ethics that we have in the modern world are way better than we did back in the old days. So not everything from the past is perfect. Again, we need to be learning and growing all the time, right? And if we don't do that, we get stuck in some pretty rough places that I think you and I are both happy are not the status quo now. And last but not least, dedication. This work requires dedication. It requires us to see it not as just a job, but as a spiritual path, as something that dovetails in with the way that we show up in the cosmos, the way that we hold space in the world. And part of that dedication, by the way, is the fact that nothing happens in a vacuum. And even the ancients understood that everything done affects the whole of things, right? That everything you do has this ripple out effect into the rest of your body, into your family, your immediate community, and eventually into the whole world. So a big part of a Wortcunning practice is understanding that when we create a little bit of healing in ourselves or others, when we create a little bit of ease, a little bit of peace, a little bit of plenty, we're actually doing that for the whole of things, which is pretty amazing. So if this kind of stuff is exciting for you, a reminder that we have the Witchcraft online program. It's a 3-level certificate program. 1 and 2 are syllabus-based. Part 3 is a cohort and teacher-based traditional apprenticeship. They happen live online. If you can't come to all the classes live, you can watch recordings, at least for levels 1 and 2. Level 3, you have to show up live online. The classes are immersive and inspiring and based in authentic Wortcraft and Wortcunning traditions. Level 1, our next cohort of Level 1 begins September 17th, 2025, and enrollment is open now. So I will put a little link down to the course below. You can go check it out, see if it's the right fit. We'd love to have you along. And with that, thank you so much for spending these 41 minutes with me exploring the Læce. I would love to hear your perspectives on this, how you see Witchcraft in the modern world, and how you see these practices showing up for yourself. And with that, peace and plenty. I'll see you next time.